Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. In this episode, we're kicking off our first video in the series we're doing on King Warrior Magician Lover by Moore and Gillette. I recently put out some other videos about what all we'll be doing in Season 2 and just level setting about where we are on the channel and stuff if you'll want to check that out. And just for some newcomers, I'm relatively new to YouTube, but we did finish the first season book series on archetypes by Dr. Anthony Stevens. And this video series on King Warrior Magician Lover represents a continuation in the vein of archetypal psychology, whereas Season 1 concentrated on the theoretical foundations, Season 2 about King Warrior Magician Lover is more about application. So while prior knowledge of Season 1 isn't required, it may be recommended. Just FYI. In this episode in particular, we're going to be talking about boy psychology versus man psychology. These are terms Moore and Gillette use to distinguish certain things. Boy psychology, just between you and I, as a sort of primer, is just the term they use for the immature actualization of the King Warrior Magician Lover archetypes. This is what happens when they're being developed, and we've talked on this channel about archetypal frustration, how sometimes people don't get what they need psychologically, so they get stuck in a rut. I think that's pretty common knowledge in 2022. I'm just kind of TLDRing it in terms of the term boy psychology and how Moore and Gillette are going to be kind of using it. So it's amazing. It's amazing and heartbreaking. Moore and Gillette were writing this, I guess, in the 90s and 80s on these subjects, which means it's probably safe to say that there was an accumulation of research years prior to that. So we're talking mid to late 80s-ish for like the development of all this literature, kind of. And what they're talking about this crisis in healthy masculinity, in healthy masculine psychology, I mean, it's 37-ish years later, right? And things are worse than ever by all accounts. A lot of the issues that they're bringing up it's like they were the first ones hit by the storm. It's heartbreaking that this kind of stuff is still going on. And I have a video on the manosphere. This is like manosphere with a degree, with a PhD. That's not Jordan Peterson. This was, I mean, again, mid-80s, this stuff was coming out. And still issues with all of this today. Yeah. So so archetypal frustration can occur and cause kind of psychological distortions or neurosis that lead people to not be as individuated as they otherwise could be. And we'll see how that kind of manifests when Moore and Gillette are talking about boy psychology. So to kick things off, I have a quote. I have some notes here in front of me. Moore says, "In the late 20th century, we face a crisis in masculine identity of vast proportions. Increasingly, observers of the contemporary scene, sociologists, anthropologists, and depth psychologists are discovering the devastating dimensions of this phenomenon, which affects each of us personally as much as it affects our society as a whole. We can look at family systems and see the breakdown of the traditional family. More and more families display the sorry fact of the disappearing father, which disappearance, through either emotional or physical abandonment or both, wreaks psychological devastation on the children of both sexes. The weak or absent father cripples both his daughters and his sons' ability to achieve their own gender identity and to relate in an intimate and positive way with members both of their own sex and of the opposite sex. Does that sound like it could have been written yesterday? Absolutely. Again, the father absence and the rise of single mother households. This all reminds me, Dr. Warren Farrell, I've mentioned him on the channel before. He's like a legendary advocate for men's issues. He says that when one gender suffers, both genders suffer. And that's what this reminds me of. And we'll get to that. What we're doing in this is what Moore and Gillette, they're articulating the problem going on about why they've invested so much time and research into exploring these topics. Like this is the atmosphere. This is what's at stake that we need to deal with. And yeah, that's what the real issue is. So he says, first, we need to take very seriously the disappearance of ritual processes for initiating boys into manhood. In traditional societies, there are standard definitions of what we call boy psychology and man psychology. There are carefully constructed rituals for helping the boys of the tribe make the transition to manhood. Over the centuries of civilization in the West, almost all these ritual processes have been abandoned or have been diverted into narrower and less energized channels, into phenomena we call pseudo-initiations, which are merely ceremonial. They do not have the power necessary to achieve genuine transformation of consciousness. We've talked about transformation and initiation before on the channel. I have a video in season 1. Definitely check that out. It's kind of my recent obsession, that kind of subject matter, and it was actually the subject matter that led more to archetypal psychology as a whole. Like first he started examining ritual practices and cultures and initiatory practices and cultures, and then that fed into his interest in Jung and the archetypes as a whole. So TLDR, the initiation of men was traditionally essential for survival and the preservation of the tribe's way of life. And this is what Dr. Anthony Stevens talked about in our last season about, archetypes are psychobiological structures in the brain that evolve through natural selection, which means that they aid in our survival. The more archetypally manifest we are, the greater chance of survival we have. That's why archetypal frustration is so visceral and so immediate an issue. And I bring up here in my notes that there's a term psychic inertia, which is that it's kind of like how habits keep you stuck sometimes, and breaking the habit is very difficult. It's kind of like that, except this is psychic inertia is kind of a cultural mindset, for better or worse, that it's basically a mindset, period, a personal mindset that gets either actualized or not actualized by the culture. And this is why cultures had initiations. Initiations are extroverted public affairs. They're not private. Meaning, like, in 2022, we have no way where you go somewhere and do something, and then after it, you're designated, you are a man. Like, that doesn't exist in 2022. I'm saying that that used to exist in a lot of other cultures and still does in some. But there is no place, especially in America, Western society, like you grow up, but like that distinction is not just part of, it's not just a matter of age or you've existed. Initiations helped break through the psychic inertia so that boys could become men and recognized as men, and then they have that identity. There's no identity crisis in that way. It's hard to even imagine because it feels like an identity crisis is like part of the American diet, right? I mean, it's radical individualism means just that. You're an individual, you're an atomized entity. And yeah, that's great. But then you may lose something. Like, who are you really as an individual, right? Without proper initiations in terms of the tribe, in terms of society. Moore says, what happens to a society if the ritual processes by which these identities are formed become discredited? In the case of men, there are many who either had no initiation into manhood or who had pseudo-initiations that failed to evoke the needed transitions into adulthood. We get the dominance of boy psychology. Boy psychology is everywhere around us, and its marks are easy to see. Among them are abusive and violent acting out behaviors against others, both men and women, the passivity and weakness, the inability to act effectively and creatively in one's own life, and to engender life and creativity in others, both for men and women, and often an oscillation between the two, abuse and weakness, abuse. It can be said that life's perhaps most fundamental dynamic is the attempt to move from a lower form of experience and consciousness to a higher or deeper level of consciousness. And we spoke about some of that when we spoke about the transcendent function last season. He says, all of human life at least attempts to move forward along these lines. We seek initiation into adulthood, into adult responsibilities, and duties towards ourselves and others, into adult joys and adult rights, and into adult spirituality. Tribal societies had highly specific notions about adulthood, both masculine and feminine, and how to get it. And they had ritual processes to enable their children to achieve what we would call calm, secure maturity. He says, our own culture has pseudo-rituals instead. There are many pseudo-invitations for men in our culture. Conscription into the military is one. The fantasy is that the humiliation and forced non-identity of boot camp will make a man out of you. The gangs of major cities are another manifestation of pseudo-initiation, and so are the prison systems, which, in large measure, are run by gangs. And Moore continues in speaking of the second factor at work in this disintegration. Like, along with the breakdown of meaningful ritual processes for a masculine initiation, a second factor seems to be contributing to the dissolution of mature masculine identity. This factor, shown to us by one strain of the feminist critique, is called patriarchy. Excuse me. All right, patriarchy. I can just to pause right here. It does not mean what it means now. I mean, keep in mind when Moore was writing this, like 80s, 90s, right? 2022 is a very politically and like socially charged world. Patriarchy has new connotations now that it didn't before. So hold judgment on the term. And this is usually a sin of philosophers. Not that I'm saying this is a sin, but philosophers are notorious for redefining words that the normal person uses. So it can make things confusing. This is kind of one of those things, unfortunately. But just try and keep in mind, just let them work in the definition before incorporating your own 2022 style definition of what the patriarchy is, right? So I have a note here regarding the dissolution of mature masculine identity. There's an expression that every woman is married to the state. I think that was Stefan Molyneux. In any case, what it means is that the logos of man towards woman was to protect and to provide. That logos meaning purpose. I know it's teleos, but it's the rationale of man, like a big part of their identity. With the military and police to protect women in society now, and the government and welfare to provide. So the military and police protect, the government and welfare provide. It may be no coincidence that men are being called out as nothing more than broken women. Toxic masculinity and all that. So let's return to Moore and Gillette here. Keep in mind when they're writing, right? 80s and 90s. They say patriarchy is the social and cultural organization that has ruled our Western world and much of the rest of the globe, from at least the second millennium BCE to the present. Feminists have now seen how male dominance and patriarchy has been oppressive and abusive of the feminine, of both the so-called feminine characteristics and virtues and actual women themselves. In their radical critique of the patriarchy, some feminists conclude that masculinity in its roots is essentially abusive, and that connection with eros, with love, relatedness, and gentleness comes only from the feminine side of the human equation. As useful as some of these insights have been to the cause of both feminine and masculine liberation from patriarchal stereotypes, we believe there are serious problems with this perspective. In our view, patriarchy is not the expression of deep and rooted masculinity, for true deep and rooted masculinity is not abusive. Patriarchy is the expression of the immature masculine. So that's the TLDR. Then it begs the question, though, what is the immature masculine? And we'll be getting into that. It is the expression of boy psychology, and in part, the shadow or crazy side of masculinity. It expresses the stunted masculine fixed at immature levels. Patriarchy, in our view, is an attack on masculinity. Let me say that again. Patriarchy, in our view, is an attack on masculinity. It's kind of something to unpack there. In its fullness, as well as femininity in its fullness. Patriarchy is based on fear of women, to be sure, but also fear of men. Boys fear women. They also fear real men. So, Moore says, the drug dealer, the ducking and diving political leader, the wife beater, the chronically crabby boss, the hotshot junior executive, the unfaithful husband, the company yes man, the indifferent graduate school advisor, the holier-than-thou minister, the gang member, the father who can never find the time to attend his daughter's school programs, the coach who ridicules his star athletes, the therapist who unconsciously attacks his clients' shining and seeks a kind of gray normalcy for them. The yuppie. All these men have something in common. They are all boys pretending to be men. They got that way, honestly, because nobody showed them what a mature man is like. Their kind of manhood is a pretense to manhood that goes largely undetected as such by most of us. We are continually making this man's controlling, threatening, and hostile behaviors mistaking them for strength. In reality, he is showing an underlying extreme vulnerability of the wounded boy. The devastating fact is that most men are fixated at an immature level of development. There's a theory, I think I heard it from that guy Pete, You Just Don't Invite to Gatherings, good YouTube channel, shout out to him, that like sometimes like women will stay with abusive partners because the way they're abusive is also kind of their strength. Like if they're beating them, that means they can also protect them, like physically, from outside forces, right? So it's kind of like the very, like that raw strength, even though it's being like used for abusive purposes, is seen as kind of a strength and asset for that mate because it means he has strength to protect her, right? So I don't know, that comment, this quote by Moore really reminded me of that. So I mean, that sets the stage. That's what's going on. And yeah, I mean, this is what we'll be talking about. He continues that it may be in truth that there never has been a time in human history when masculinity or mature femininity was really in ascendancy. We can't be sure of that. What we can be sure of is that mature masculinity is not in the ascendant today. He says, this book, we hope, will contribute to our successful accomplishment of this vital task. Excuse me. One final concluding passage that Moore and Gillette articulate here. They say, in this book, we have been concerned about helping men to take responsibility for the destructiveness of immature forms of masculinity. At the same time, it is clear that the world is overpopulated with not only immature men, but also tyrannical and abusive little girls pretending to be women. It is time for men, particularly the men of Western civilization, to stop accepting blame for everything that is wrong in the world. There's been a veritable blitzkrieg on the male gender, what amounts to an outright demonization of men and a slander against masculinity. But women are no more inherently responsible or mature than men are. Men should never feel apologetic about their gender as gender. They should be concerned with the maturation and the stewardship of that gender and of the larger world. The enemy for both sexes is not the other sex, but infantile grandiosity and the splitting of the self that results from it. That's massive. And, Moore and Gillette are not the first. It's amazing. I can't get over it that this was going on. I was born in 85. So this was already a thing in 85. The issues that the manosphere deals with. Manosphere is like probably 5 years old, maybe 6 years old. That's when it sort of blew up. But it was in primitive states, of course, before that. I'm not saying that was the origin point. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. I'm just paraphrasing. But it means that this is a generational, it's kind of like a generational abuse. Like they talk about that in families. Like alcoholism gets passed down. You know, this sounds like societal, generational abuse that just keeps getting passed down. This war between men and women. And because of the internet, it's exploded, and you know, we can see the issues in real time and what's going on. But you know, pre you know, standardization of the internet, you know, that it was still going on with all this. So that about does it for this video. This is why self-knowledge is important. You know, especially for men. For our purposes in this video series, this is about men and unpacking their archetypal frustration and untangling it and processing it and acquiring a tool to do just that. And that's what we're getting into in the series. But again, back to Warren Farrell's statement about when one gender suffers, both genders suffer. Men are in a crisis. And that means women are in a crisis. Now, it may not be as obvious on the women's side of things, but I think, at least from what I see on the internet, exploring a wide variety of manosphere content casually, there are starting to be problems on the female side as well that have resulted from just these issues. And what we're doing is we're trying to be responsible for our own lives, our own individual lives, one by one. And as we do that, we become more mature, and that makes society more mature. But there's going to be some like delay. Like if men were all completely psychologically mature tomorrow, because of the feedback between men and women, there would be a delay before women kind of picked up on, oh, this is how things are. There's things feed back and forth. Men look to women to see what they want so that they can be that thing, so that they can attract them. I mean, we're obsessed with that. We wouldn't have humanity if men weren't obsessed with that. Which is, yeah. It's a big subject, is what I'm trying to say. And I find it heartbreaking and fascinating that, like, exploring the issue from the archetypal psychological angle. And more specifically, more in Gillette's articulation and of all those nuances and how it fits into their paradigm of king, warrior, magician, lover. So, I hope that the point of this video is clear about boy psychology, patriarchy, and how it's caused through the lack of standardized initiations in society for boys to become men. Without that, there's an identity crisis. The identity crisis leads to archetypal frustration. Archetypal frustration leads to patriarchy. Patriarchy leads to abuse. Anyway, I'll see y'all in the next video. I'll be looking out for y'all in the comments. And take care. Bye-bye.